So tragically, Islamist terrorism has returned to Europe. On Friday in Arras in northern France, a teacher was stabbed. And then on Monday, 3 Swedish people were shot. 2 of them died ahead of a football match friendly in Brussels. Tom, these events came after the call you alluded to earlier, about the call to jihad from a leader of Hamas, but we don't necessarily know that they are linked. In any case, it is still a very worrying development.
I mean, it would be a hell of a coincidence is one thing to say. I mean, in both of these cases, so the 20-year-old in northern France, as you were suggesting, he pledged allegiance to the Islamic State previously, but the authorities there are still saying that they're open to this being linked to the Hamas conflict because of, as we've already been talking about, this is very much seen in the context of a kind of global Islamist terrorist movement. Similarly, the shootings in Brussels, again, the individual who has actually been shot and killed by police now pledged allegiance to the Islamic State beforehand. It would seem that part of the motive here relates to the recent Quran burning controversies in Sweden, which he makes a kind of oblique reference to in one of his videos. But again, the authorities there are leaving open the possibility that this is connected in some way, inspired, was the spark for something that he might have been wanting to do for some time. And so it's really kind of brought it home. But then it hasn't, because certainly in the UK at least, I mean, I know there's obviously a lot going on in the world right now, but particularly the attack in northern France was talked about for about an hour and then completely moved on from. And that was something that I found particularly chilling. And in both cases, actually, they really underline the tremendous failure that various Western European governments have had in trying to tackle this particular problem, with allowing it to incubate amongst certain portions of the population, just in basic security failures as well. I mean, in the case of the Brussels shooter, who is a Tunisian national, he has been on the radar of the authorities since 2016. He was actually there illegally. He had his asylum application rejected in 2020. They were already aware that he had been radicalised, but the response of the Belgian justice minister was, we had so many referrals at that point, it was impossible to keep track of him. And a not dissimilar picture in relation to the 20-year-old Chechen who committed this horrible atrocity in northern France, who was a known Islamist extremist. He was interviewed by the French by the French security services the day before he launched this particular attack. His father, who was seemingly also an extremist, was deported in 2018. So again, you've kind of got this sense of foreboding and a kind of sense of, could we be on the kind of cusp of another kind of wave of these kinds of attacks, which have been given a kind of rocket fuel by what's been going on in Israel. But at the same time, there being that real inability to grasp the threat amongst various Western European countries, which seem struck with the same problem, which is that there is a small minority, but a not insignificant amount of people who are fully paid up Islamist terrorists waiting for an opportunity to strike. And you just can't help but feel that, as ever, there's been a kind of sense of complacency in taking that threat seriously. Yeah,
Jake, it does feel like, whenever these attacks happen, we do move on very quickly. We don't seem to, have much of a discussion about how to actually, properly confront this threat, even though it's persistent. It's been around for decades. What do you make of that kind of sort of response?
Well, I mean, I was very involved in the last spate of terror attacks that started off in 2015 in Vatican. Because back then I was a foreign reporter, and so I covered them all from on the ground.
Yeah.
The Bataclan attacks in Paris, Nice, Stockholm, Berlin, Istanbul, Sri Lanka, the bombings there, and others that I've left out. Berlin, Brussels.
Yeah.
And in each of those, or many of those cases, the attackers came from areas of the city, their respective cities, that were almost no-go zones for police. In Brussels, for example. In Brussels, I recall covering the attacks there some years ago. And they came from Molenbeek. And Molenbeek is it is one of those. It's almost exclusively populated by first generation, second generation immigrants from the Middle East and North Africa and Africa itself. It's very, very hard to police. There's a lot of extremism there, and I remember from the time that the local population closed ranks to protect those terrorists, even though they didn't necessarily support them in their ideology. There was enough sympathy and suspicion of the outsiders of police to close ranks. And this is a significant problem.
Yeah.
Significant problem. I mean, you know, cities in Sweden where I've covered the gang warfare there, which is coming out of those, immigrant communities. A lot of it has came over into Europe with the migration trail, which again I covered because it was really beginning when I started off on the road. And it's a policing nightmare. It's very, very hard to follow all these strains of gangland violence, of mafioso, tribal warfare, and of jihadism, some of which overlap or interlink or support each other, relate to each other. And I think that really outside of that, in the West as a whole, I think we do not have the moral structure with which to acknowledge what's going on without being afraid that we're being racist.
Yeah.
We don't have the language. We don't have the confidence in ourselves that we're not racist. We don't have that confidence to be able to recognize the problem and diagnose it and deal with it without undermining ourselves, fearing that we're racist. It's a bit like the Rochdale grooming gangs, you know, partly because for years we've been undermining our own sense of self, undermining our own moral compass but with all this this move to campaign against ourselves and against our history and against our values, that we're structurally racist, that we have white privilege without even realizing it, that we're racist by default, that we have this original sin, that we're post-lapsarian, we're born in sin, we're born in the sin of racism, and we can't breathe, we can't act, we can't make judgments, we can't stand up for ourselves and our values because all of that is tainted with entrenched racism. And therefore, we don't have the ability to look at these problems in immigrant communities realistically for what they are. Within that, it is, as you were saying, is a sort of reverse racism.
Yeah.
That we can't treat them like every other citizen of this country or of the West or of Europe and enforce properly and expect the same standards as we expect of other citizens. The only way is to turn a blind eye because we don't want to be racist, and therefore it's the soft bigotry of low expectations that we express towards them.
Yeah.
So it's this total moral mess that we found ourselves in. And it all comes from undermining our own values willfully. It's self-sabotage that we've been engaging in for not just a few years, but for a long time in this country, that's hollowed out our moral fibre and made us unable to deal with this sort of situation.
I think that's a really important point as well, because I think the moral mess that we're in, sorting that out is the prerequisite for all the other problems. This is not just a technical issue.
Yeah.
Insofar as do we have enough people keeping tabs on known extremists and so on. If you fundamentally don't take the threat seriously, and the fact that it all stems from this bizarre situation we've ended up with, which is to be a good person, you have to ignore some very terrible things. You have to turn a blind eye to some of the most horrendous abuse, terrorism, you name it, is something that we've really got to get a grip on, not least because of the fact that it's so frankly ridiculous. It helps absolutely no one, and also it buys into what seem to me to be some pretty basic stereotypes. I mean, the idea that to take Islamist terrorism seriously risks alienating British Muslims, say, is to conflate the two perfectly. It's to suggest that the Venn diagram is actually just a circle. But that's essentially how people carry on. And I think it's worth, just as an example, I mean, it's almost 2 years to the day since David Amos was murdered in his constituency surgery by an Islamist terrorist. 2 years ago, that's something which is, broadly speaking, forgotten about. He's talked about almost as if he died of an unfortunate accident or something like this. And if anyone remembers the debate that we had after that, it was absurd. It was about how we need to clamp down on people trolling politicians on the internet. We need to be kind to politicians. Aren't they nice, kind, serving people, and so on. There was a proposal for a David's Law to stop people being mean to politicians on the internet when he wasn't killed by a tweet.
Yeah.
But the ability to displace the actual problem because of this profound fear of being racist, which can actually end up with you being racist, if you see what I mean, is something that surely has got to be brought a stop to if we're going to actually tackle this. But there's just no signs of that awakening, shall we say, on the part of the elites at this point.